Okay, it is an honor to introduce our next speaker for today, Laurel Eckhouse. Laurel is a quantitative social scientist focused on racial inequality in the criminal legal system. She's interested in complicated concepts, messy data, and using research to assess injustice. Laurel has a PhD in political science from UC Berkeley and has been a faculty member at the University of Denver and the Prison University Project. Thank you for joining us, Laurel.
Thank you so much for having me. So let me share my screen so I can talk a little bit about, so I can start my talk. Let's continue. Let's try this version. Great. So today I'm going to be talking about my about a piece of research that I did primarily during my academic career. And what I hope that this will help us understand in terms of thinking about data and quantitative analysis for social good is the way that data can reveal framings for problems that aren't necessarily the ones that people use automatically, right? Can help us understand which ways of understanding the contributors to a socially important problem are most important and best at helping us understand what's going on. Let me see. Okay, yeah, great. So the core question at the heart of my research is what explains racial disparities in police violence? The image shows the funeral of Philando Castile in Minneapolis in 2016. Castile was shot during a traffic stop in a suburb of Minneapolis, a little bit before this photo was taken, obviously. And the traffic stop it's just like a devastating experience. He was pulled over for a minor traffic issue and ended up getting shot by the police officer who stopped him. And so when people think about police violence, I think it's important to put a little bit of context around kind of how important a problem this is. So somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people per year are killed by police. Castile is not in any way alone. Up to 1 in 3 stranger homicides are by police. So when people are shot by somebody who's not someone that they know, up to 1 in 3 times that's a police officer. Black Americans are 2.3 times more likely to be shot than whites. And between 1.5% and 2.5% of the 41 million people who report police contact experience use of force by police. So that's from the Police Public Contact Survey. This has really significant consequences. I think it has obviously the consequences to the people who experience violence by police, both lethal and non-lethal. It also contributes to other forms of violence by damaging access to the rule of law. It makes people unsafe, unable to seek formal legal assistance in dealing with conflict in their lives. And it also has significant feedback effects that disconnects people from the state, from access to medical services, from all kinds of other services that might be useful for them. When we talk about what explains racial disparities in police violence, most of the time people argue that it's all about implicit bias among police officers. There's a ton of research about this. I think it's very clear that implicit bias and unconscious bias are things that most people experience, that police officers are not different in that way. And this idea that it's primarily about implicit bias is actually so widespread that in 2016, during the presidential debates, Hillary Clinton was asked why does she think that police violence is unevenly distributed by race, and what she said was that she believed that it's primarily about implicit bias. So policy recommendations focus on implicit bias, focus on changing the cognitive processes of police officers. And that's, the problem there is that we don't actually have any data or information that shows that it's actually possible to change people's implicit bias. And perhaps even more than that, if we were able to change people's implicit bias, it's certainly extremely difficult to change it in these highly charged split-second decisions where there is a ton of emotion and threat going on in many cases, right? And so this focus on implicit bias leaves us with this question of okay, well, what are we going to do, right? And what I propose is a different explanation. right? The differences in exposure explain differences in police violence, right? So exposure disparity is a concept that helps us understand why police violence is so unevenly distributed by race. Typically, when people talk about police violence, they're really focused on this decision to use force. But when we think about exposure disparity, we don't just look at the data on like how much more likely is a person to experience the use of police violence in a specific incident, right? Once they've already been stopped, we go upstream. And so we think about, instead of just this question about the decision to use force, we think about things like deployment and engagement. So where are police sent? What decisions are they, what are they asked to do? How do they make decisions to engage? And what does that mean in terms of the amount of exposure that people experience? And one of the things that we know is that people of color are significantly more likely to be stopped and engaged by police than white people, right? And they're significantly more likely to be stopped and engaged by police, even if they're doing exactly the same, engaged in exactly the same kind of like moment-to-moment behavior as white people. And so what that means is that people of color have significantly more opportunities to encounter police than white people typically do. And this brings us back to this question about Philando Castile, right? So Philando Castile was actually pulled over 49 times in 13 years, often for minor infractions. And that's just a level of exposure that is like significantly, he experienced significantly more exposure, significantly more opportunities for police to engage in use of force than somebody who gets pulled over, once or twice in those 13 years. And so that means is that, even if only, 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 encounters with police end up with use of force, well, Philando Castile is pulled over 49 times in 13 years, right? So he has many opportunities to encounter police violence, and many more opportunities to encounter police violence than a similarly situated white person would likely experience. And so this exposure disparity, the idea behind this exposure disparity is that it essentially produces significantly more risk and opportunities, more probability of contact. And so even if the probability of experiencing use of force once you have experienced contact is the same, then people of color are going to experience significantly more force. Even if we could absolutely get rid of implicit bias, if we don't get rid of exposure disparity, then we're going to end up with significant racial inequalities in police use of force. Okay, so what do we know so far, like kind of before we think about this, this additional reason? Oh, sorry, I'm going to just pause and say that in order to examine this question, to try to understand, like, is exposure disparity really the main thing that contributes to, like, a primary contributor to police use of force? I'm going to look at national data, but then I think you'll see that national data doesn't really help us understand this in enough detail. So then I'm going to take a look at a very specific example. And I think that really speaks to the extent to which when we're doing quantitative analysis for social good, a lot of times we look at kind of like what are the big patterns? How do we see these like kind of large scale patterns? And then in order to truly understand whether a particular dynamic is at the center of what you're talking about, then you end up needing to zoom in and look more carefully at a specific incident. So in other research, we see things like people will look at questions like, how much more likely are people of color to experience use of force than white people? We really only have data about shootings and other lethal force. And honestly, I'm not totally confident that we can trust the lethal force data for things that aren't shootings, because it's often possible for police to change how they're recording a particular incident. And police use of force just creates like a huge number of data problems, because the people who are recording the incident use of force are also the people who are potentially liable for what they record, right? What we do know is that Black Americans are about 3 times as likely to be shot by police as whites. And we can see that the risk ratio is as high as 20 in some counties. So in some counties, Black Americans are up to 20 times as likely to be shot as whites. There's one piece of research that looks at a sample of Houston interactions. And what Fryer finds is that police are actually as likely to shoot white civilians as Black civilians. the problem here is that we don't know, it's hard to construct the reference population. If we're trying to understand how likely is somebody to be shot by police, one of the core issues that we're going to run into is how do we understand who we're comparing people to? What Fryer does is look at particular types of arrests that are particularly likely to lead to shootings, right? So he looks at comparisons of people who are resisting arrest, whether they do or don't get shot. The problem is that it's very easy to code someone as resisting arrest because they were shot, right? And so we know that the administrative records are biased by differences in investigation and contact, so we can't necessarily really trust that. And truly, like, one of the things that Philando Castile shows us is that really any incident can potentially lead to violence, right? We don't actually know up front whether there's like whether a particular incident is likely to lead to violence. And so the solution really to this problem is that we should primarily consider all of these contacts. We should look at basically every time somebody encounters the police, and then we should look at how likely are people to experience police use of force in all of those contexts. And so the first thing that I do is I look at, I do like a simulation. So I look at arrest data. So, and I basically take all arrests in the United States as a proxy for police contact. Obviously, that's not like a completely accurate measure, but the arrest data is widely available. It's nationally collected. We have reasonable confidence in it, like actually recording the number of arrests. And so then I look at the total number of arrests, and I ask how many people are killed per arrest, and what would happen if we equalize the number of arrests versus if we equalize the number of killings per arrest, right? And so if we look at right now, so this is for Black civilians specifically, using 2015 data. So if we look at it right now, in 2015, there were 382 people shot, or 382 Black civilians killed by police. If we were to equalize the probability of shooting conditional on contact, we'd end up with 280 Black civilians shot. Whereas if we equalize the probability of contact, if we made it so that Black civilians are equally likely to experience arrest as white civilians, you'd end up with a significantly greater reduction in risk. Exposure disparity in this situation seems to explain a significant amount of the racial inequality in arrests. The problem is that we also want to know, does reducing exposure actually work, right? So what happens if exposure declines? Does police violence also fall? One of the things that people say is that, well, do police just keep making the stops that are most likely to lead to violent interactions? And I think people who justify police violence are often saying, like, look, the stops that are most likely to lead to violent interactions are the stops that are most important. It's important for police to engage in those situations. And as a result, even if you kind of get rid of a significant number of police stops, well, you're not going to get rid of the violence, of police violence. And there are a lot of problems with that argument, but one of the main problems with it that I want to show today is that I actually don't think it's true, right? And so in order to assess this, we need something more granular. We need to look at a situation in which stops go down, and we need to see what happens to stops versus use of force. And so there's actually this really great specific opportunity to do that if we zoom in on a quasi-experimental situation in the NYPD. So there's a sudden reduction in exposure to police contact, which Jonathan Mumolo identified. And the cool thing is that we have highly granular data, and we can look at, have a broad assessment of the effects, because we can look specifically at all of these different outcome measures. So I just want to give a little bit of context on what stop, question, and frisk is in the NYPD. So stop, question, and frisk is the cornerstone of NYPD order maintenance policing. These are Terry stops. They involve reasonable suspicion. You end up with 3.2 million stops between 2008 and 2015. The probability of being stopped for Black and Latino teenagers was estimated as high as 0.79. So really like 80% of Black and Latino teenagers being stopped. And the peak was in 2011 with 682,193 stops, nearly 400,000 of which were of Black New Yorkers. one of the things that's interesting about stop and frisk, about stop, question, and frisk, and the thing that's interesting about stop, question, and frisk in our context is that there's a sudden reduction in the use of stop, question, and frisk. So the Center for Constitutional Rights had filed a lawsuit against stop, question, and frisk. They made a specific filing on March 4th of 2013, saying that the UF 250 form, this is the form that documents stop, question, and frisk, should be modified to include a narrative portion for police officers to justify the basis for stops, frisks, and searches. On March 5th, 2013, there's a memo that goes out to the NYPD. And this says that effective immediately to ensure that all documentations regarding UF 250s are standardized, the circumstances or factors of suspicion must be elaborated on in the additional circumstances / factors sections. So there's a narrative section that's required. It's photocopied and turned in. And one of the things that we hear consistently in research on policing is that paperwork reduces the extent to which people are willing to do something, right? It adds friction, it makes it more difficult to do it. People end up doing less of that activity because there's more documentation and paperwork required. This is something that in my own research, I've actually had conversations with police administrators who are like, well, we wanted people to stop using some particular tactic, so we made it so that they had to complete 3 forms. We saw reductions in that tactic. And indeed, this is what we see in New York, right? And I should also mention that the NYPD officers who were interviewed about this afterwards say, like, hey, we interpret this as we should be doing less, we should be doing fewer stops, not just, this is annoying, but also we interpret this as a memo from above saying that we should be doing fewer stops. And so what you see actually is this like very significant decline in stops, right? There's this big discontinuous jump basically on the day of the memo, where you go from the total number of relatively high number of total stops to a significant decline, and then that declines further and further over time. So that stop, question, and frisk becomes a significantly lower factor, significantly smaller factor in NYPD order maintenance. That's what happens to the number of stops. But one of the things that's really interesting is that the vast majority of the stops that disappear are actually stops of Black civilians. So you can see that the number of stops of white people does decline over time, right? But there's nothing like that discontinuous jump. Instead, you see this very, very significant discontinuity in the number of stops for Black civilians in New York. So our question is, what happens to, when this happens, what happens to the use of force at the same time? It looks exactly the same, right? The number of uses of force decline basically in the same way. And so I think this is a great example of how we can use data to really zoom in on a problem and identify specific incidents that shed light on a much broader problem, right? This suggests that if you reduce the number of stops, if you reduce the number of encounters that Black civilians have with police, then you're also going to reduce the use of force significantly over time. And just sort of for completeness, one of the things that you can see is that the percent of stops with use of force, there's no discontinuity there, but there is a sort of like gradual increase over the later stage of the use of force. But you can see over the later stage as stop and frisk declines even more. But you can see that at no point is it enough for the number of stops with use of force, for the number of Black New Yorkers who are exposed to police use of force to then go back up. Okay. So this is just a different quantitative way of assessing that. So before, Black civilians' risk of use of force is 11.32 times whites. After, the risk ratio falls to 8.85. There's a 22% reduction, and it's very similar to the 24% reduction in exposure. Okay. If we do the same simulation for New York City that we did for the nation as a whole, we look at the use of force on Black civilians, and we think about how that actually changes the experience, how changing the risk of exposure versus the risk of force conditional on exposure would change the outcomes. You can see that if we this is a sort of existing number. If we were to, the initial number, the 12,061 Black New Yorkers experience use of force, if we were to change that so that the probability of force conditional on contact is equal, that goes down to 8,924. But if you were to equalize the probability of contact, the actual risk of exposure, what you end up with is 1,440 uses of force. That's a really, really big difference. This difference from equalizing the risk of contact of force during a specific stop versus equalizing the overall context. And the final thing I want to talk about, so we're nearly at the end, but the final thing I want to talk about is what about the arguments for stop, question, and frisk? So the main argument for minor arrests is that stops are important to prevent violent crime. This is actually not supported by research. Violence typically arises from private conflict rather than public disorder. But I think the other thing that's really important to think about is what are the trade-offs that we encounter? Oh, you know what? This is actually how that slide is supposed to look. I'm not sure why the other one showed up. Anyway, I thought I had deleted that slide. Okay, so the main argument for stops is confiscating guns and preventing violence, but it's not really supported by research because violence primarily arises from private conflict, not public disorder. But I also think we should think about, in any context where we're thinking about stops and thinking about why people argue for stops, we need to think about what the trade-offs are. So if you think about 2011, the peak of stop and frisk, we're talking about 1,087 stops of Black civilians per day, 241 uses of force, and you're really only identifying 8.5 weapons on average per day. But this number actually is much, this ratio is actually significantly worse than you might think, because many of those 8.5 weapons are knives, and in New York City, gravity knives are illegal to carry. Gravity knives are any knife that you can flick open without having to, like push something aside or anything like that. The problem is that if you use a knife regularly, right? If you're a tradesperson or someone else who needs to use a knife regularly, the knife loosens up. The mechanism of the knife loosens up, and so a lot of the people who are carrying gravity knives are actually just carrying a knife that they've had for a long time and used significantly, like used extensively in their profession, in their nonviolent profession, right? And so really we should be thinking about guns. Well, we've got 241 uses of force for 1.6 guns. And actually make a outcome table for this where you can kind of go down here and see the ratio. And you can see that over this period, especially in the period before stop and frisk declined significantly, the ratio is really, really high. You're using force on over 100 people in order to be able to identify, like, for every single gun that you need to identify. And I think that trade-off needs to be part of any conversation about about the goals of strategies that are intended to get guns off the street. Okay, so I think the main thing I want to leave you with is the idea that stops are really risky, right? Anytime that police are encountering a person, they're really risky. It's really risky. You're creating a situation where you might end up with use of force, you might end up with conflict, you might end up with somebody losing their life, right? There are, in some cases, benefits to stops, right? So preventing dangerous driving is important. Lots of people die because of car crashes, but we need to think about alternative ways to engage with situations like that don't involve putting people at risk of death. And I think the final conclusion that I want to leave you with is that exposure disparity is a key explanation for racial inequality in police violence, and that when we're thinking about how to explain racial inequality in police violence, we really need to be thinking about exposure and not just about what happens within stops. And from the perspective of people who are doing quantitative analysis and trying to do quantitative analysis for social good, I think what I encourage you to do is both to zoom out, to think about a process as more than the individual interaction that you're potentially concerned about, and also to zoom in and try to identify specific situations that can shed light on these broader processes. I think that's
outstanding. Thank you so much, Dr. Eckhouse. My goodness. I have so many things so many threads I'd love to pull on there. just as a point of kind of intellectual connection, some of the work that we have done, including some work that'll be talked about later today in one of the talks, is we have a research lab that looks at judicial sentencing disparities. And I think some of the things that you're encouraging us to think about are really instructive for how we think about that, right? So I think what I'm mapping to is thinking about police violence as overrepresented for Black and Brown communities, which we also see in judicial sentencing, but then thinking backwards to, well, that doesn't necessarily mean, it can partially potentially be explained by judge bias or bench bias, but there are a lot of parts of the system that may be over introducing people into the judicial ecosystem, right? And I think there are many of those things that have to be interrogated, but even understanding the judicial bias requires us to then work backwards and find those loci, right, that are actually causing these problems.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this is, when you think about judicial kind of assessments of people, recidivism is a key element, right? And I think that the idea of recidivism as a concept is really, it's a really problematic measure, right? Because if you think about the racial inequality in how people are brought into the criminal legal system, well, you could imagine two people who engage in exactly the same behaviors, drive at the same speeds, smoke the same amount of pot, take the children to the same school, right? And if one of them is a person of color and one of them is white, the person of color is a lot more likely to be arrested for those same behaviors. Then if they get arrested again, now they have a prior, right? And so the extremely common practice of considering people's prior arrests and convictions itself bakes in the racial inequality of the criminal legal system into sentencing. Right. And so that's an incredibly common practice. I think you'd be hard pressed to find people who don't think that that's something that to find kind of mainstream judicial organizations that think that that's illegitimate. And yet it's really a way of incorporating systemic racial bias into individual decision making that isn't primarily about the kind of the internal cognitive processes of judges. It's about a extremely broad set of norms that incorporate that instead.
Fair enough. All right, let's try to get to one more quick question. Dr. Eckhouse, I appreciate the simulation study to explore this issue in more detail. Are you able to talk more about the assumptions that were made in your simulation framework?
Sure, totally. So it's a really simple simulation, right? So basically let me just pull up a screen where I can go into a little bit more detail about it. There we go. Let me just pull this up. Yeah, so the really what this is looking at is conditional probabilities, right? So I'm saying that the probability of force, conditional, and population is just a simple decomposition of how conditional probabilities work. Is the probability of force, conditional, and contact times the probability of contact, conditional, and population. And so what I do is I look at this simulation, I look at the number of arrests, and I say that I use arrests to measure contact. And so I look at the probability of contact, conditional, and population. So that's the number of arrests divided by the number of people in that demographic category. So in this case, Black civilians in the United States as a whole. And then I multiply it by the probability of force, conditional, and contact, which in this case is just the probability of the number of killings divided by the number of arrests. And what that allows me to do is to make an estimate of what's the probability of force, conditional, and population under different regimes, right? And then I use that, I apply that to the population numbers as a whole, and make an estimate of the total number of people who would be affected under assumptions of equality in either the probability of contact, so that's the probability of the number of arrests per population, or if we equalize the probability of shooting conditional on contact.